Isn't it amazing you guys know that stuff now? That's so cool. We're continuing. We left Genesis. We've say goodbye, Genesis. Bye. And we're jumping all the way back to Hebrews. If you remember, way back at the beginning of the year, we looked at the first 4 chapters of Hebrews. And we're going to do some piecemealing in the next bit of it to sort of wrap the book up. And so it comes right off of that Genesis setup with the kingdom and it being a temple space. If you remember, he talked about there's 6 days of creation, and the 7th God dwells within it, just like the temple, 6 days of building the temple, the 7th God dwells in it. And we're going to tie it all together with an understanding of what the writer of Hebrews ultimately wants the people to understand that have read it. So a quick reminder of the book of Hebrews, right? So the author begins the book basically to a bunch of persecuted Jewish Christians who've converted, and they're being tempted to go back to Judaism. They're being tempted to push away from what they've learned and to return back to what they've known. And the writer spends the first 4 chapters saying, everything that you think you want to go back to is actually not as good as what you've converted to. Remember, Jesus is greater than the angels. He's greater than Moses. He's all of these things. This is this exclamation of these first 4 books. And so the last bit of Hebrews tries to tie it all together by piecemealing now the point of Jesus and showing how Jesus is this fulfillment of all these promises that came earlier with the temples and the first covenant. And so the writer of Hebrews, we're going to pick right back up. But that's kind of where we've been. And so Hebrews now 4 through 10 is going to unpack this idea of Jesus filling this role of the high priest. Everyone say, Jesus, the high priest. You're going to know all these things by the end of this series. So really excited. Hebrews 4:14 through 5:10. If you want to get it up, we're going to read it and then kind of jump our way through it. So 4:14 through 5:10. It's actually not as long as it seems. It's pretty short. Since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet did not sin. Let us approach the God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. 5:1. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters to God and offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and go astray, since he himself was subjected to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of people. And yet no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son, today I have become your father." And he said in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to those he could save from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. And he was designated to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Are we good? We got it. Okay, good. Hebrews gets started right away with the very reasons why Jesus is better than any mere human priest. So we get Jesus has ascended into heaven, right? So in the old covenant, the merely human priests would go into the Holy of Holies. So if you remember, we're going to make this work. Everyone picture this with me. This is about to be a whole thing. Imagine this room is the temple. Are you here? Are we with me? Okay. Imagine that this is where the priests go, this rug. You with me? Good. Now imagine that this, like the back of this rug is the Holy of Holies. And this is where they put this is where the Ark of the Covenant is. If Indiana Jones was alive in the time of the Hebrews, it would have been much easier to find the Ark of the Covenant. It was in the back of the temple. And inside there, and there's 2, he says cherubim, because he speaks Hebrew better than me, but cherubim. You know this, the cherubim. They're not the cute little bows with the big bellies, but they're terrifying. Anyway, there's 2 of them on top of the Ark, and the area above it is the throne of God. That's where he rests, above his throne. So this is this space. So make sure I get this right. Yes, so the priests could go into here to offer sacrifice, and then once a year, the high priest, the super priest, if you will, would offer sacrifices for himself, on the Day of Atonement, he would be able to enter the Holy of Holies to offer sacrifice on the Ark of the Covenant. So instead of an altar, he would pour, it's a whole thing, but they would pour blood over the Ark of the Covenant once a year, an atonement for all of Israel, even if they've not made it for a sacrifice. It happened once a year. So they would be able to enter that spot once a year. So these human priests would go in there to present sacrifice, and they would come back out with this aroma, right, of burned meat that was burned on the altar, or of burned bread or barley, whatever it was that was being offered. And this sacrifice would then rise up, and the people would be able to smell it to know that it was accomplished. And that was how they offered sacrifices. But the writer here, right, Jesus, this fully God, fully human person, made a sacrifice, and he himself ascends into heaven, where he's still sitting. So if you catch it right in there, it says we have a great high priest who ascended into heaven. So instead of just being the smell, are you with me? Instead of just being the smell, the aroma of this offering, Jesus ascends into heaven. This is how the book of John ends. This is how Acts sort of sees him ascending into heaven. So we're making this claim right away that the human priest just burned stuff, but Jesus, the actual sacrifice, actually rose up and now sits on the throne in heaven. So he's not just hanging out around. He's done what the offering did. So in chapter 5, verse 6 and 10, the author of Hebrews mentions that Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Anyone ever heard of that guy? Melchizedek. Oh, look, well, good. Would you? No. I was going to be like, why don't you explain for the class? No. He doesn't explain himself here, but there's an entire chapter in chapter 7 dedicated to teaching us about Melchizedek. So we're going to jump ahead, and we're going to try to understand him a little bit and not do too much because it can get kind of boggy, but it helps us understand why this is important to the writer. It's not the easiest passage to immediately understand in 7 because it's written for a first century audience, and you're expected to have some significant understanding of the history and spiritual customs of priests and their orders in ancient Israel. So we're going to try to understand that. It's a lot of explanation, but if we can get this figured out, if we can understand math and engineering and science, we can absolutely understand Melchizedek. That's what I think. So I'm going to go slow here. We're going to piece it together. Hang with me. And we're going to learn 4 key characters to help us understand this. The first one, I hope we have an understanding, is it's Jesus. Everyone say Jesus. Have you heard of him before? Good. He's the Son of God, right? One with God, human, divine together, creator, sustainer of the universe. He stepped down on earth. He took on flesh. He lived a perfect life, died on the cross, and was raised back to life. So Hebrews, this is who the writer of Hebrews is helping us understand. He's trying to help us understand that Jesus is better than any man, better than any heavenly being, better than any leader, better than any priest, and he's in the middle describing how Jesus is even better than the high priest. So that leads us to our second characters. They're the priests. Say priests. Priests. Priests, particularly the high priest, was a very important person in the lives of the Jewish people. If you took the Old Testament Bible study, you know that in the setup of Israel, it's a theocracy, so God is the actual king. And then there's people who serve underneath. There's the high priest, who is the voice for the people to God. And then on this side over here is their prophet, and they're the voice of God to the people. And then eventually they add a third one, and it's a king. And they, because they like everybody else has kings, but these are the 3 people who rule in place. So this is one of the 3 top flight people in the whole of Israel, is the high priest. They're like the cabinet of God. He's top tier. A priest represents the people to God, and he's an intermediary representative. So the high priest was the highest office of the priesthood, the main representative, the greatest responsibilities, the most elite credentials, high quality character, and we need this spiritual representative, right? Because we've done this before with our timeline, that God is so holy and so set apart and so perfect and unsustained that there's nothing anywhere near in glory and authority or justice that we can't approach it. Do you remember this timeline? Like, how close do you think you are to perfect? And we're all like hugging this wall. Or you remember this? So this priest stands this intermediary who can help close that gap. That's the high priest's job, to help us approach without facing judgment. So in Old Testament, without priests, the relationship with God is largely severed, cut off, and they would be under judgment. Without any priests, there's no connection. Are we good there with our second character? Great. Our third character is Abraham. Everyone say Abraham. God makes a covenant with Abraham and says, I will bless you and your offspring will be more numerous than the stars. And so he's the father of all of the Hebrew people. And so if you look at his family tree, eventually he has a son named Isaac, who has a son named Jacob, who has 12 sons, one of them named Joseph, who sings about his colored shirt a lot. And then there's Levi, with whom Moses and Aaron would eventually come out of. And from the line of Aaron, we get the Levitical priests. Everyone say Levi. Now say Levitical. Now say Levitical. There you go. Now you know why they're called Levitical. They come from the line of Levi. They're the Levites. Great. So this is where the priests come from. Jacob, the other name to know, is Judah. Say Judah. From Judah's line comes King David and Solomon, and more kings until eventually, from the line of David, right, the line of Judah, Jesus. So these are the two lines that we kind of have to follow along: is Aaron's Levi priests and Judah, David, Jesus. So we're good with Abraham, the father of all things. He's super daddy in all of the Hebrew characters. He's big dog. And then the last one is finally our guy. This is the most fun name to say, so we're going to practice it. Say Melchizedek. Now, say it like you mean it, like Melchizedek. Melchizedek. Good. In the entirety of the 39 books of the Old Testament, almost 600,000 words, Melchizedek's name is only said 2 times. Must be very important. Only shows up 2 times. He's basically mentioned in passing in 2 different stories. If you were listing the end credits to a movie, he'd be the guy at the very end who they were like also appearing, and it would be like Melchizedek at the very bottom of the whole thing. He's almost not important, it seems. But in Hebrews, we get an entire chapter devoted to drawing our attention to how Jesus is like Melchizedek. That feels like we should know why that's important. So let's see this connection. So Hebrews is calling us back to an interaction that Abraham, who's Abraham? Super daddy of all things. He has an interaction with Melchizedek in order to remind the readers who are, remember, they're Hebrews, they grew up knowing all this stuff, why these details of how Jesus fulfills a priestly arrangement, even though the priests come from the line of Levi, and David to Jesus is through the line of Judah. So he doesn't have a lineage to claim priesthood. Does this make sense why they're making an argument suddenly? You understand now? The Levites come from the line of Aaron, so that's where the priests come from. How could Jesus be a priest if he is off the line of Judah? You with me? Great. This is why we have this coming up. So here's the key details to understand. In Genesis 14, if you would like to read it, it's an exceptionally boring little passage. We have Abraham meeting Melchizedek. But here's the key things we learn about Melchizedek to help us understand. He is the king of Salem. Say Salem. Say Jerusalem. Good. Do you hear it? Great. He's the king of Salem. He is a priest of God. And he's tithed to by Abraham. He's tithed to by Abraham. So what is a tithe? We've heard this. We've said this periodically sometimes in here. What is a tithe? Giving. Yes. Go ahead. Giving to them. Yeah, you give to them. It means tenth, right? You give a tenth, right? Whatever. So Abraham tithes to Melchizedek. Who is Abraham? Big super daddy. So if Abraham is giving, this will be important. Keep this in mind. In the ancient world, right, a tithe was offered to recognize someone as a superior. So in worship, a tithe to a priest was recognize the priest's authority to intercede. So if you had a sacrifice, you would go and let's say you had like an elof of barley, and the priest would take a tenth of the barley that you brought in and they would keep it for themselves. This is how they ate. They would turn it into bread and they would eat it themselves, and the rest of it would be put into the offering. If you brought an animal, they would cut off the pieces and the good piece would go there, but they would keep some of the animal so that they could feed themselves. So this is how the priests operate. So if you tithe to someone, you're recognizing their authority. So Abraham tithes to Melchizedek. Melchizedek was not a Levitical line, because we're not there yet, and so he wasn't owed the tithe by law. There's no reason for Abraham to have done this. So the fact that the writer of Genesis, right, tells us about this is the recognition that Abraham sees something in Melchizedek that he has to recognize him as a superior. But Abraham is super daddy. But he sees something here. He sees a superior. And so so then Melchizedek blesses Abraham. This is what we get in chapter 14. It's a very strange interaction that happens. So then in Hebrews 7, again, I'm not going to read the whole thing. This is what we learn about Melchizedek in Hebrews 7. This is another one. that he resembles the Son of God, Jesus, in these ways. Melchizedek resembles the Son of God. He's literally is he like an eternal being like Jesus? No, because the term resembling is very important. The root word in this original language is similarly used in the Gospels when Jesus talks in parables. It's like when it says, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, or the kingdom of heaven is like yeast in a big thing of brew. So the writer's saying they're like each other. He's drawing a comparison here. They resemble each other. Melchizedek, we find something, he's a typology. If you were writing a book, a typology is when you, it's like when Willem Dafoe is cast in a movie, he's the villain. Do you know what I mean? Or like he's just the villain. He's typecasted. Or like who's the I can't think of a guy now, but you know what I mean. You watch a movie and somebody help me. AJ, Lord of the Rings, Boromir, Sean Bean. If he's in a movie, what does Sean Bean do? He dies. That's just going to happen. It's typecasting. So Melchizedek is a type. He's a typology. He's like a person, a series of events that's meant to point forward to something even better. So we have this interaction in Genesis. It seems like it's pointing to something, and then the writer of Hebrews picks up on it and points it forward to Jesus. It ties these two things together for us. It's a prophetic symbol, this foreshadowing representation, a wink and a nod to something bigger. You see Sean Bean, there's no surprise, Sean Bean's dying. You see someone like Melchizedek, he's pointing to something that's going to be greater than the lines that are established. And so the writer picks up on this. So it says that Melchizedek was without a recorded genealogy. That's interesting. You were an Old Testament thing. What is the most important thing of your status in the old world? What is it?
Your lineage.
It's your lineage. It's who's your father? Who did you come from? The lineage, this is how people become Levites, priests, right? This is the line of David, how you become kings. This is how you know that you're different things. This is why the genealogies begin a couple of the Gospels to prove where Jesus comes from. But with Melchizedek without genealogy, abnormal, very strange in the Scriptures, particularly for an individual who Super Big Daddy decided to tithe to. How does he know he's good if he doesn't even know where he comes from? So this inferiority, right, or this inferior nature of the Levitical priests, right, because Levitical priests, they can do this, right? They can come in here, and then how often can they do this? And who gets to? Good. And then what happens to them eventually? They die. Because why? They're just people, right? They're just people. And so this nature of these Levitical priests, these men who die, is contrasted with this eternality of this priesthood of Melchizedek. Because it says he lives in the line of Melchizedek. Melchizedek lives. Kind of strange way to put it, right? It's foreshadowed, this no genealogy is like, where did he even come from? Is he eternal? Where is he from? So we have this contrasting nature of priests who will do their thing and die, and Melchizedek, who Big Daddy decided to tithe to, who seems to live? Question mark? The Hebrews leaves it up to question. So he's a priest forever, is how the writer puts it in Hebrews. Not in a genealogical line, because he's not a Levite, but by appointment to God, is how the writer tells us. So Levitical priests in the Old Covenant were allowed to serve for 30 years, usually a lot less, because they didn't live that long. So they had priestly duties they could no longer fulfill, and then they would move on or they would die. So they had to rely on execution of succession plan after succession plan, and hope and trust that someone new would be raised up that could take over. So the these high priests die, the regular priests die, and it takes this constant work of succession plans and making sure the next generation is ready to go. But it says here with Melchizedek, this is an eternal priest. There's no doubt, no worry, because you're covered, right? Melchizedek, it's an eternal priest. His lineage just kept going. Do you see the contrast the writer's making here? Good? Good. With Melchizedek's priestly position, along with this absence of this lineage and credentials, and this confirmation and recognition from Abraham, right, Super Daddy tithes to him, that there's this appointment to God that Melchizedek had as a high priest. This is what the author of Hebrews is telling us, that these other priests are born into it and they learn and they die. But Melchizedek, Abraham saw in him that he was a priest appointed by God. No genealogy, he didn't have credentials, he didn't have a paper from a college saying he had a seminary degree. Just something about him, Abraham recognized he's an eternal priest appointed by God. Totally different than the other ones. The author's trying to say, Jesus is like Melchizedek. He can serve as the high priest, not based on his lineage, because his lineage is David, Judah, not Aaron, Levi, but based on this indestructible life. It would require an eternal being, and Jesus fulfills this requirement. So Melchizedek, this real priest, this king, he wasn't the prophesied coming Messiah, but he was typecasted. He's meant to point forward to the Messiah that would walk on earth 2,000 years later in Jesus of Nazareth. So we have this eternal priesthood appointed by God that Jesus can fulfill because he doesn't have the lineage for it. So how could Jesus be a high priest? And they said, well, he's like Melchizedek. God appointed him to this role. Not because of lineage, not because of whatever, because of credentials, but because there's something about him that's different. Does this make sense why the author of Hebrews is referring to Melchizedek? And then we can leave him behind. And then every time you can watch Jeopardy, and it'll come up and it'll be like, something, something, and the answer will be, who is Melchizedek? And you'll know from then on. It's that important. Are we good? Great, we're going to leave him behind. So in 4:15, man, I'm losing my voice. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who's been tempted in every way just as we are, yet did not sin. So we get Jesus is sinless, but we see that he was tempted in every single way that we are. And I think about that for a minute. Every kind of temptation that has come across mankind, Jesus has faced. This is the claim the author of Hebrews is making. Brainstorm yourself for just a second here. What kind of temptations do you face? What kinds do you tend to give into? Don't have to answer it out loud. What other kinds of temptations do you see other people's falling into, right? He faces all those and perseveres through. So you can boil down. You can be like, well, he never had to figure out if he could Google something, But like think deep down, like keep peeling the layers back, like what at the heart of it is going on. And he faced all of those sorts of temptations and moved on. This is the claim the author is making. We're going to tie this all together. 5, 7 through 8. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the ones who could save from death, for he was heard out of reverent submission. The Son, though he was, he learned through obedience from what he suffered and was made perfect and became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obeyed him. So Jesus, he suffered and he wrestles in prayer, but our great high priest never gave in to the battle. He was sinless. And so in 5:3, we have this merely human priests who offer sacrifices for themselves first. This makes sense. So the high priest on the Day of Atonement, he's got to sacrifice for himself first. Why? Because he's not sinless. You with me? He's just a person. Okay? So he sacrifices for himself to make sure he's good. Because if he enters into... How far away are we from God, right? We're all the way over here. And if you get within... You'll see this in Isaiah 6. This vision of the temple, and Isaiah's he sees just the hem of God's robe in the temple, and he's like, whoa! And his brain melts, basically. Because perfection is mind-blowing. And so if you get too close to it, it gets weird. Things get strange. You start to the world unravels around perfection. And so they clean themselves, because if they go in here and they're not clean enough, what happens? They die. So much that it was common enough in Jewish writings, they would tie ropes around the high priest, so that if they opened the curtain to the Holy of Holies and stepped in and were killed because they weren't clean, they could pull the body out. So, you with me? Are we all good so far? This is going to get strange. But we have a Jesus now who's sinless, right? These merely human priests, they offer sacrifices for themselves and then for other people. But Jesus, the author's saying, as our great high priest, his sacrifice was perfect because he was perfect. You with me? So this is why you've got to kind of understand Levitical stuff to get what the writer is saying here a little bit. Jesus obeys perfectly in his temptation and suffering. He doesn't need to offer a sacrifice for himself to save himself. He makes a sacrifice strictly to save people. Does this make sense? Great. He obeys perfectly. How many of us in here obey perfectly? Right? No, we don't. We don't do that. Even if we think we do, you don't. There's been a time in your life you haven't. In any situation. The idea that Jesus is without sin has this effect of making us feel... Does anyone here... Okay, this is just me maybe. Sometimes I'd be like, Jesus was perfect and you're not. And I'm like, okay, so I'm garbage then, right? Is that anyone ever be like, that's me a little bit? Like, I'm not great. I'm going to tell you right now. This is Phil being honest. I'm not a great person, right? AJ's laughing. My wife would be laughing. Because we're not. We can feel like it's this oppressive thing. Every time I do this thing, right? How far away are we? Does this gap feel just ginormous, right? Boy, how do I ever get over there? And that feeling should be right. That's the right feeling. That's precisely the point that the writer of Hebrews and want us to know. That's the nature of the gospel. This is the confession that we're supposed to hang on to. That you can't close this gap. Does this make sense? The ancient Israelites knew it. They couldn't close the gap. That's why priests stood in the way. Are you with me? They offered sacrifice because it was too far. The priests worked on your behalf to do it. I lost my spot. That's the point, right? This confession that we hang on to, you're unworthy. That our high priest in Jesus, right, the Hebrews author's writing, is sinless sacrifice to help make us worthy to approach. So the fact that Jesus is sinless, it can help make us think like maybe he's like looking down and like shaking his head like a disappointed dad sometimes is what I think. But what this passage is supposed to do is about how does the sinless Jesus feel about us, right? How does a priest, the human priest, feel about their people? How do you think the human priests felt about the people of Israel? Were they like, Jim's back again, got barley, robbed his neighbor, he's an idiot. You with me? Or were they like, did they care about them? Are you with me? Did the priests care about the people? Would they have kept doing it it was tedious work. They butchered animals and drained blood. It was awful. It was hot. It was in the middle of the desert. It was not the best work in the universe. But they did it because they cared about the people. So the writer of Hebrews is like, you can feel like you're distant. But the point is, if Jesus is the high priest, then there's a connection. Because the high priest serves for the people. Are you with me? In 5:2, it says Jesus takes on our weakness. He became God. He, being God, became a man, faced every temptation just like we do, and he deals gently with us. The point of the passage is to help us know that Jesus understands our weakness. This is a word I like to use called empathy. Say empathy. That's actually a better translation. Jesus empathizes with our weakness is a better way to translate it. He doesn't look down on it. He sees it, knows it, and has compassion on it as the high priest, and he wants you to trust him with it. To fix your eyes and your mind on him, like the obedience, temptation, suffering, enduring trial, all these things that Jesus faced on the cross. This is why he's able to save us, right? He obeyed where humans didn't. He obeyed in our place and passed the test that Adam failed in the garden. So the book of Genesis shows us that God puts humanity in the garden, right? They grow and they cultivate it, but instead it's become selfish disobedience. And so Christ enters creation, even though he was tempted the same way Adam was, even though he suffered similarly to Adam, he didn't give in to that temptation. And so that's why he's declared to be worthy of being the great high priest in the order of Melchizedek. He's the anointed priest, not the one that gets it from lineage. He did it because we couldn't do it, right? So we failed to obey, and then we have to look to Jesus, not to feel guilty, but to feel gratitude for the mercy that's presented for us. And that's what the author of Hebrews is trying to get us to do in today's passage, right? In light of the fact that we have a high priest who's superior to the old covenant priests, the priesthood, who was sinless, who can sympathize, and is the source of our salvation. So let's tie this all together. 4:14. Therefore, since we have the high priest who has ascended into the heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let's hold firmly to the faith that we profess. It says, hold fast to your confession. Sometimes that's a translation you guys might see in there that it says, hold firmly. Did anyone have hold fast as their translation in there? Hold fast to the confession. The idea of holding fast is like how a fastener on a toolbox keeps it shut tightly. This is how you're supposed to think of. So if you latch down the toolbox, you can pick it up by the lid and it won't pop open. It's holding it tight and fast, so it's gripping tightly. You can and should feel secure about the things that you believe. This is what they want us to think. So remember, these are people about to fall away in Hebrews. They're being tempted to turn back, and he says, no, hold fast to the things you believe because it's secure. It's secure. You can feel secure about these things because Jesus really does forgive sin. This is the author's point. His sacrifice really was enough. He really is the high priest. He really does empathize. He understands you. He really does care about you in that office. And so the second thing that it's encouraged to do in light of the high priest of Jesus is in 4:16. For we have this great high priest who is let us then approach the throne of God with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Because now that someone stands to close this gap, he's really there interceding on our behalf, we can approach the throne with boldness. Pull this all together, ancient Hebrews. I am a priest. You with me? What happens if I go in here? Right, and who gets to go in there? I'm Joe Schmo, and I come into the temple with my goat or whatever. We'll just make it barley. That's easier. And I want to give an offering. Can I just push the priests out of the way and walk in here? No. And what's in here? The Holy of Holies. What's the actual object? The Ark of the Covenant. Indiana Jones would have been much better then. And there's 2 cherubim, right? The cherubim, like in the garden, there's 2 cherubim that guard the entrance to the garden. Interesting. And then above it is called the seat, the throne of God. This is where God rests. So the author of Hebrews says, you can approach the throne of God with confidence. You can do this. Can anyone do that in their mind? One person, right? One person. So they're saying, approach the throne of God with confidence. You don't have to have someone stand in between you. Are you with me? So this is all connecting in their brains. Jesus did everything we need to face up to God. So he invites us to come to him boldly, right? What does it look like to approach boldly? And Jesus luckily talks about this. He says it's like children. There was a time when Jesus is teaching the crowds, and he's standing around, and they're all amazed at their teaching, and everyone's in awe, and then kids just push through the crowd and walk up to him. That's the best thing about kids. If you met someone famous, you would be like, that's Taylor Swift. Oh my gosh. My daughter would just be like, do you know where bathrooms are? She wouldn't know any difference. Kids approach boldly. Have you ever seen a kid shy up to someone? They're just push crowds out of the way and do whatever they feel like. It's amazing. This is what Jesus says. Approach the throne like a kid. Approach God like a child. They're not impressed by the things adults are impressed by. Right? Jesus is preaching, and these kids come up to him, and the disciples try to push him back because they're annoying. And Jesus says, no, let them come to me. Don't let them stop. This is how you need to come to me. So approach Jesus' throne like kids. Jesus says if you don't, and you try to make it about yourself to get cleaned up and act proper and religious and polite and Midwestern nice, that you won't enter into the presence of God. He says, truly I tell you, whoever doesn't receive the kingdom of God like a child can't enter it. Hebrews 4:16, we'll end it out here. Let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence that we can receive mercy and grace to help us in our time of need. Notice, what is it we're supposed to enter the throne of God for? What does it say? In our time of need. Do you ever find yourself having a whole, like these Hebrews? This is our think for yourself moment here. Do you ever find yourself having a hard time holding on to faith? So let's remember, these old Hebrews, and they're thinking they're gonna turn away from this and go back to what they knew better. They're not holding on fast. And they're saying all this stuff. So the writer of Hebrews is saying, hey, do you ever find yourself having a hard time holding fast onto faith, right? Do you have a hard time remembering that Jesus did what he did? Or obeying perfectly, refusing temptation? A hard time bearing up the suffering, and when it feels like you just want to quit. This is the writer's getting at. Then you are supposed to go to God's throne in that time for the help. Not when you have it all together. This is the biggest point. It's not once you have it all together. That's what the throne of grace is for. You approach it with boldness in the time of need. You don't have to do what the high priest did, get all dolled up, you with me, to enter in. You approach it boldly. There's no curtain there. And you're supposed to go when you're not cleaned up. This is the writer's getting to. Perhaps there's some people in here who have never been to the throne of grace before. That maybe you haven't believed in the high priest being Jesus. That the verse is an invitation to you, right? That you can approach God's throne with boldness by believing that Jesus did everything necessary to close the gap between you and the perfection of God. And that begins with a trust in what it was that he accomplished. So this whole series is going to continue to break this down, of how Jesus fulfills what this high priest did through the sacrifice, the blood, and atonement. So let's pray.